Ouchie, wouchie. This one wasn't good, y'all. It's getting harder and harder to be a JJK fan every week. If you haven't caught up yet, today we're talking about chapter 269 of JJK, and it's one of the worst chapters of JJK, if not the worst chapter of JJK I've ever read. You remember those Kusakabe yapping chapters at the beginning of the Gojo and Sukuna battle where we were like, hey, just give us the Gojo and Sukuna battle? But no, we were just served to 17 pages of needless explanations. Yeah, imagine that, but the context is way worse. Because before, when we were getting needless breakdowns on techniques that we didn't really care about, we could still be like, oh yeah, but Gojo and Sukuna are battling somewhere and we're gonna see that soon. But if you insert that same idea into what is supposed to be the third to last chapter in this story, the context of the situation is such that why are we talking about this? In a universe that is quickly becoming beguiled from all sides on account of the fact that the author seems to have an inability to give satisfying character conclusions and wrap up a universe that was teased to be one of the most in-depth and complicated and beautiful universes we've ever seen in manga history, the decision to go, oh, okay, cool, we'll explain things in the conclusion of this story, and then decide that the things that you want to explain are the rules behind the new Shadow Simple Domain school and how they restrict people with binding vows is one of the most asinine and out-of-touch writing decisions I've genuinely ever seen. Hey, we want Arame's backstory. We want Kenjaku's backstory. We want to see the Heian era. We want to know what's going on with cursed corpses. What is Gaku Ganji up to? Why did Gojo hate the elders so much? What's going on with the three legendary families? Gojo, who was the only representative of the Gojo clan left, is dead. Maki is the only Zenin left. The only standing Jujutsu royal family are the Kamo. What's that doing to the shifting narrative of the higher-ups of the Jujutsu society? Where's Tengen? What would the merger have looked like? How close were we to the merger? Why did we not even see it? And so many other questions. But no, what did we get from chapter 269? One of the last chapters of this story. Yuta's alive. It happened off screen like so many other important moments in this manga. And we're going to dedicate half this chapter to introducing a character, a system, a school, and binding vows you've never heard of. At least MHA literally showed us that Hawks became the new president of the Hero Society, gave us a time skip, and so much more. How is JJK fumbling the bag this bad? But I'm super cool and calm and collected about everything. Everyone's alive. There was barely any consequences, and the shadow style. But I don't know. Hey. Maybe there's going to be a part 2. So yeah, as you can tell, today we're going to be talking about chapter 269 of JJK, the roller coaster that it was. And if I was you, I would strap in and get ready for what is going to be one of the more complex videos I've ever had to make about a chapter of JJK. Because this chapter makes some of Togashi's more writing-heavy chapters seem simple. So sit back and definitely don't relax, because today we're talking chapter 269 of JJK. Explained. Before I slowly lose grip on something I love more than a lot of the people in my life, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel I created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mond called Anime IRL. Podcast, you know it, Otaku's Anonymous, second biggest anime podcast in the world. God, follow it! I'm sorry, it's not you, okay? It's not me either, actually. It's Gege. So, chapter 269 doesn't at all start off where chapter 268 left off, which was focusing around Team Gojo and them going to check up on Yuta. Nope. Chapter 269 starts off in a candy store with an editor's note of, at a small candy store on a street corner, we see Meme place what appears to be a candy bar down in front of what appears to be the shop's owner and ask, how much? Weird place to start, but it gets weirder because the next page starts with Maki yelling out, you bastard, and apparently she's yelling it at Yuta, who's fine. Maki continues on by saying, don't think everything's all lollipops and rainbows just because you're back to your old body. And now to this point that it's revealed that Team Gojo had heard the you bastard from Maki at the end of chapter 268. And Team Gojo's entered the room and Megumi is trying to be a child of divorce by butting into this head-on-head conversation. And thus Megumi says, Maki? At which point Maki turns away from her husband and says, oh, hey, Megumi, how you feeling? Megumi then continues on by saying, a little bit foggy. Is this from Unlimited Void? I didn't realize it would feel like this, but I'd like to apologize to everybody. Now, Megumi being a bit foggy makes sense. Gojo hit a bunch of civilians with a 0.2-second unlimited void in the Shibuya incident, and while it wasn't fatal for any of them, it did take the majority of them 2 months to regain total function. Now, obviously, Megumi, as a sorcerer, would be less inclined to being crippled by unlimited void, but the unlimited void he was hit by, as Sukuna's vessel, was longer than 0.2 seconds. Maki then says later, never mind, actually, no, you have nothing to apologize for anyways. Now, to this point that Yuji, as another child of divorce, realizes, oh, my time to step in, and says, well, I have stuff to apologize for. And it's at which point the Kusakabe, as the real father of the situation, says this is all because Gojo didn't kill Itadori at the start, implying that all of the events of JJK happened because Gojo didn't kill Yuji when he consumed Sukuna's first finger. Now, that's kind of true and kind of not. Obviously, if Yuji had been killed by Gojo, then Yuji wouldn't have been able to consume all of Sukuna's fingers, and as nobody else on Earth was a strong enough vessel to even carry 2 of Sukuna's fingers, then yeah, the situation wouldn't have gotten nearly this dire if Yuji was dead, but Kenjaku probably would have just tried again. Listen, Sukuna's twin reincarnates every single generation. Kenjaku would just go take more back shots. Kenjaku was like Frank Castle in court. He was like, I love doing it. I'll do it again. And Kusakabe continues on by saying that an Itadori was a victim of Kenjaku playing Jujutsu terrorist. He then tells Yuji that he was firmly in the pro-execution camp, saying that you have Yaga to thank for me being here in the first place and me not pushing to get you murdered. He goes on to say, I don't think either side was particularly wrong. Each side had their own truth. You kids shouldn't feel the least bit guilty. You're all careless brats. Feel free to act like it. This is the shame of us adults. And that's actually really fair. See, while technically, yes, I would probably fall on the, hey, let's not execute the kid because he ate one of Sukuna's fingers camp, if hypothetically they had executed Yuji, you know, thousands of people would have survived. Now, they had no way of knowing that Kenjaku was out there playing Jujutsu terrorist and would probably just make another Yuji in another 80 or so years, and they could have continued to manage Sukuna's fingers as they popped up as finger bearers one at a time. But yeah, there definitely was nobody in the wrong. Least of all, Team Gojo, who are, like Kusakabe said, children. And that's pretty much where I stop agreeing with this chapter, because Yuji turns to Yuta, who he was told alongside us as the reader that he was going to have to go help cheer on to recover from his grievous injuries in battle. But then in actuality, he just walked into a room and the biggest threat to Yuta was Maki. And thus Yuji asks Yuta, how are you able to return back to your body, Yuta? And now it's time to get an exposition dump. As Yuta goes on to say, I have Rika-chan to thank for that. I thought her not coming with me to Gojo Sensei's body was us severing our connection, when in actuality, Rika was constantly using her reverse curse technique to maintain my body and heal it while I was away in Gojo's body. On top of this, Yuta's body had already been treated by Ieri, whose curse technique allows him to freeze people in a form of stasis, like he did for Nopra. Essentially, what Rika was doing was maintaining the bodily functions of Yuta's body after it had been put in stasis by Ieri after his brain had been transferred out into Gojo's body, which is, you know, fine. Yeah, Rika was shown holding on to Yuta's body after he had transferred over to Gojo's body, and yes, she was fully manifested, even though it didn't appear as though she went with Gojo. So the natural conclusion that I came to is the same conclusion that Yuta came to, that their connection had been severed. And now Rika, as the Queen of Curses, was simply going to exist as a cursed spirit, though probably a cursed spirit that would help humanity, and maybe Yuta as Gojo. And I thought this was an interesting possibility. Rika could go fight against the likes of Sukuna by herself, but nope. She was just using reverse curse technique to keep Yuta's body warm and his heart pumping while he was out being Gojo. And for those of you who are like, oh, Nick, what do you mean? How could his heart be pumping? His brain wasn't in his own body. Sukuna survived without a heart. Reverse curse technique does pretty crazy things. I would like to take this time to talk about the fact that Yuta did switch into Gojo's body, though, because, what did it accomplish? See, there was a really cool narrative right before Yuta switched into Gojo's body, that Gojo was the only person willing to monsterize himself for humanity, and that Yuta was willing to live up to the standard set by Gojo as the second strongest person in the Jujutsu society. And thus Yuta underwent something incredibly brave, and in return got Gojo's body, something that should have made him instantly one of the strongest entities in the universe. And all he kind of did was domain clash Sukuna and pseudo purple it, which, I mean, yeah, allowed for Todo and Yuji to get a jump on Sukuna, but I mean, they could have just done that without Yuta switching into Gojo's body. And then they were like, oh, will Yuta be able to switch back? And then he just did. That'd be like putting $1 million on 23 in roulette, it hitting, buying an F1 car, taking it for one lap, crashing it, and being like, well, you know, that one lap was fun, I guess. What was the point? Breathe. It's a story, Nick. Breathe. Yuta continues on by saying, but I really thought I died when Kenjaku's curse technique burnt out inside the domain. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where you're going to need to get your notepads out. This is where we just begin to explain posthumously what happened in the battle against Sukuna. And somehow it makes everything more confusing. Well, Meme chimes in and says, well, we can consider that a slight miscalculation. We thought Kenjaku's curse technique would continue operating even after opening your domain. And did it not? Like, they have a domain clash, and then there's a big fisticuffs fight, and then, oh, look, a red or a blue pulled up a voice recorder, and then it's like, poop your pants, and then there's a purple. There was a lot that happened after the domain clash. Like, I really don't know what Meme is referring to here. Meme then continues on, I'm gonna have to read this directly from my scans. It was likely an application of barrier technique that allowed for him to make use of multiple curse techniques and actively separate them. Now, I'm assuming this is in reference to the fact that Kenjaku had access to multiple curse techniques, like anti-gravity and all the other curse techniques that he had stolen from previous bodies. Curse manipulation, maximum uzumaki, all that. I believe what Meme is saying here is that Kenjaku used barriers in his own mind to separate certain curse techniques from each other. However, she could also be saying that Kenjaku's domain expansion allowed for him to separate the curse techniques that he has and use them separately from each other. And unfortunately, both of those explanations kind of make sense based off everything we've seen from Kenjaku. Maybe then goes on to say it's obvious for somebody who's used the technique for 1,000 years, and therefore Kenjaku would be more precise with this ability than somebody using a fresh copy. And that makes me feel as though what we're talking about is the fact that Kenjaku's brain swapping technique used a barrier technique to separate his curse technique, his brain swapping technique, from the curse techniques of the body he was swapping into. And therefore the reason that Yuta might have collapsed his Gojo sooner than originally anticipated is because he was unable to create that barrier between the brain swapping technique and the infinity. But once again, I'm not entirely sure. Yuta then chimes in and says, well, after the technique recovered, as to what technique he's talking about, I don't necessarily know. I'm assuming Kenjaku's body swapping technique. After, let's assume, the body swapping technique recovered, I was in a state of suspended animation. Now, I'm assuming this is in reference to the fact that the body swapping technique requires somewhat constant updates. Like when they were talking about switching Yuta's brain into Gojo's body, they said there was 3 possibilities. The body swapping technique required continuous input, that it required intermittent input, and that it required input very rarely. And if it was continuous or it required input every couple of minutes, that was going to be bad for Yuta because his copy only lasts 5 minutes. But his copy technique couldn't have recovered because, like he says later in this sentence, he wasn't connected to Rika, and Rika is how he gets his copy. So I'm assuming he's saying his body swapping technique recovered, but that doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense to me considering what we know already, considering the fact that his copy technique should only last 5 minutes and he was copying the body swapping technique. So that technique shouldn't recover for him. But whatever, he's in a suspended state of animation and he eventually gets reconnected to his external source of cursed techniques, aka Rika. He then literally yada yadas by saying, and then we eventually got here thanks to all of you. I'm so sorry to have worried you all. That's it. Technique recovered, suspended animation, connected to Rika, recovered. I mean, it's an explanation. I would have liked to see it happen. Yuji, being Yuji, gets over it immediately as he yells out, "Don't sweat it." But Maki, the mom of the situation here, does not get over it immediately. As she says, the real problem here is that if Yuta conducted himself even remotely more intelligently, this battle would have been a lot more easy. And it's at this point that we, for some reason, get real retrospective. Sure, the entire world is yelling at you to explain your universe. Let's step by step go over the fight that all of us just read. Maki steps in by saying, first, I should have led the attack against Kenjaku. Then then there's Higuruma's executioner sword plan. If we used Inumaki's remote curse speech activation in Higuruma's domain, this fight could have been over in a flash, and therefore Higuruma should have had the tape recorder with him. And it's this point that the narrator steps in, gives us a little necessary exposition, saying that curse speech cannot be activated more than once simultaneously. And therefore, until the tape recorder is played, the technique is considered in use, which means that only one tape recorder was allowed. Thanks, Gege. Good job explaining. I mean, I guess it makes sense, because if we're breaking down, oh, Higuruma should have had a tape recorder, oh, Yuta should have had a tape recorder, some people are going to be like, well, give everybody tape recorders. But it's at this point that the 530,000 IQ person in the room steps in and says, yeah, nah, Maki, you're wrong. See, you can't be seen as a target for my Boogie Woogie, because she doesn't have cursed energy. Betting on a Okotsu to succeed in a surprise attack without my help would have been very risky. Not to mention, Okotsu and Rika's power was necessary for stopping all of the cursed spirits that flowed out of Kenjaku. Now, something interesting is said here. It's said in a very subtle way, but it's also a very important piece of information. See, everybody wondered how Yuta was able to get the drop on Kenjaku. See, while the tentative explanation that we got is that Kenjaku was having so much fun with Takaba, which, by the way, where is Takaba? Did he die? Did he just, like, will himself to death? That he didn't notice Yuta's approach. However, what's being revealed here is that the real reason that Kenjaku didn't feel Yuta's approach is because Todo used Boogie Woogie to put Yuta directly behind Kenjaku, which subsequently led to Yuta getting the drop on Kenjaku and cutting his head off. And that is a cool tidbit of information that I will give this chapter props for. Unless we already knew that, and I forgot, which is a genuine possibility. Tiny Panda then steps into the conversation and says, I also have a point, as he says that Inumaki's curse speech being used against Sukuna could really only happen in the scenario that it happened in. At least if Inumaki wanted to survive. See, because by the time that the curse speech was used against Sukuna, not only was he surprised and not seeing it coming, he was also heavily injured. And therefore, Panda continues on by saying that if we had used curse speech against Sukuna when he was feeling fine and dandy, the blowback would have killed Inumaki. Which, like, would have been fine. Oh, Inumaki died for the blowback, but we stabbed Sukuna with the executioner's blade? Yeah, he died for a good cause. Give his body to Rika, and then boom, it's like he's still here with us. Inumaki then confirms by saying, Salmon Row. Higuruma also pops into the we're putting Maki down conversation, saying that Sukuna was just toying with me. He could have killed me at any time if he wanted to. And if somebody like Yuta was there, he probably would have. I'm assuming what he means here is that Sukuna didn't deem Higuruma as a threat. However, if Yuta was around, Higuruma would have become more of a threat, and thus he would have had to kill Higuruma. So Yuta not being around for Higuruma's battle against Sukuna is what kept him alive. Which, like, by the way, Higuruma's alive means officially, the only two people that died during the battle against Sukuna were Choso, a cursed spirit, and Gojo. And, like, if we're being real, if you gotta take either Choso or Higuruma, take Higuruma. Like, I get it. People love Higuruma, but really, all the characters introduced after the Shibuya incident, it's like a half care. They're like step kids. He's a cool character. He's had some great moments. But if there's one character you don't need to pull out of the death bin, I think we can all agree it's Higuruma. Hell, I could say the same thing for Kusakabe. Like, Higuruma and Kusakabe both being alive, I mean, the Disney Kaisen allegations may or may not be correct. They're both two cool characters, and I'm happy they're alive, but, like, do they need to be?
Well, maybe Kusakabe needs to be alive because he needs to become the next head of the new Shadow School style.
I always mix the words up. Higuruma goes on by saying that curse speech is easy to counter. I'm the one who decided that it would be best used inside of Yuta's domain where nobody else could interfere. On top of that, with no violence allowed in my domain, using it would have been impossible. And that's a dumb point, objectively. There's no violence allowed in my domain. Yeah, man, until you get the execution order, and then at that point, you use Cursed Spirits. You already have the Executioner's Blade. That's violence. Kusakabe then says what we're all thinking. It says, well, it's still pretty crazy that a guy who just became a sorcerer 2 months ago is still kicking after all that. At which point, Higuruma tells us it wasn't intentional. And like, yeah, man, we know. We all saw you get the X. Maki, then apparently sick of having all of her points fact-checked like Donald Trump in the debates, goes, regardless, the backup from abroad. And it's at this point that we see Miguel and LaRue walking, and Miguel is sneezing. If those two had been here from the start, things might have been different. And like, yeah, and it's this point that everybody looks at Yuta and goes, that's true. So Maki won some points. Good for her. But Yuta goes on the defensive immediately and says, they told me they weren't coming. I told you it was a long shot. To which Maki responds by saying, and yet they came anyways. And Yuji, once again, as a child of the divorce, goes, easy now, please. don't yell in the kitchen. He then goes to back up Yuta, who Maki has by the throat, as he says that Yuta's cursed tools allowed for me to hide my lost fingers, which reveals to us what those red and gold gauntlets that Yuji was wearing for the entirety of the battle against Sukuna were. I mean, yeah, we knew they were cursed tools, but apparently they were cursed tools that belonged to Yuta, which really doesn't actually explain anything. But then again, how much explanation do you need about the red and gold gloves? Actually, a little bit would have been nice. Maki then counters his point with her second really good point, which is you could have done that with gloves. Yuji then chips in and says, but Yuta also hindered Sukuna when he tried to open his domain a second time. And what Yuji is referring to here is that after Yuta/Gojo collapsed, the bits and pieces of his domain expansion that were still floating around, he used to stop Sukuna from opening another domain, a domain that probably would have killed Yuji and Toda. Hikari then says, I thought being able to stand by in sight of Rika was pretty useful. And I believe what he's referencing here is that when Gojo and Sukuna were battling, the Kusakabe coalition hung out inside of Rika so that they could jump into the battle whenever necessary. And because they were able to stay close to the battle, the second that Gojo was cut down by Sukuna, they didn't have to skip a beat in jumping Sukuna, and therefore were able to separate Urame from Sukuna from the jump. So without Rika and Yuta, that wouldn't have been possible. It's at this point that Toda steps in and says, listen, not everything is Yuta's fault. Some of the things are my fault. I worked with Meme to prepare for getting people out of Sukuna's domain, and yet Choso and Yuji, he calls him my brother, were still caught up in it. Now it's at this point that Kirara, and like, was Kirara in this fight? Like, she's talking like she was in this fight, and I genuinely don't remember her doing anything. But anyways, the femboy steps in and says, well, isn't that a technique range issue? To which Toda responds by saying it was more of a cursed energy issue. Apparently the cursed energy in the center of the circle of Sukuna's domain expansion is so dense that Todo couldn't grab Yuji and Choso. Ino then says, I was in the eye of the domain expansion as well, but we jumped into action and saved me. Ino says that he should have saved Choso. But Yuji interrupts and says, I would have died if that happened. It's no one's fault. And hold up. You're telling me we had a choice between Choso and Ino and chose Ino? Listen, I love the Shiesty sorcerer as much as anybody else, but maybe grab Choso. Maki then goes on to say, well, I'm not trying to blame Yuta. It kind of seems like you're trying to blame Yuta. I got hit by 2 black flashes as well, which also like isn't really your fault. She then goes on by saying, but never mind, which leaves Yuta puzzled and confused. I believe what Gege is driving at here is that Maki's upset with Yuta because A, he's probably the strongest person still left alive, and B, because he was so reckless with his life, and she loves him. And this is how she shows it. It's at this point that we just check in with all of the people we simply don't need to hear from, as Miwa feels the need to chip in and says, I was terrified. And it's like, yeah, no duh, Miwa, you used all of your power to try and hit Kenjaku and he caught the blade. She goes on to say, as Maki-san's mark, not entirely sure what that means, and as somebody who couldn't participate in the plan against Sukuna's domain, which also doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me, like her whole thing is simple domain. If I was one of the only ones saved by Todo-senpai's technique, I don't know what I would have done. And I'll let you know what you would have done, Miwa. Died. Painfully. Kusakabe then chips in and says, I told you not to get involved in that fight. Miwa says, I didn't do anything, which is self-aware, and that you would have objected had I told you. At this point that Momo, I totally forgot her name, Witch Girl, also feels the need to chip in and says, I'm sorry, I didn't do anything. And it's like, hey, Momo and Miwa, if you didn't do anything during Sukuna's battle, just fade into obscurity. It's what you've been doing for the past 60 chapters. Meme, who also didn't do a huge amount during the Sukuna battle, chips in and says, well, your broom gave me a lovely ride. Hikari, who kind of did something during Sukuna's battle, even though we didn't get to see it. I wanted to help in the battle against Sukuna after taking care of Urame, but they use the pronouns they. Interesting. Hikari, well-known femboy lover. Urame ends the story with their clothes off, uses they-them pronouns. Were they fighting, actually? Nobra then chips in by saying that I was asleep until the very end. So, at this point that the hits keep rolling, and we just keep checking in with people I don't need to hear from. As Wee says, well, everyone has their regrets, but I don't think anybody would object to the fact that I was the true MVP of that battle, and honestly, I can't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, yeah, there was more important people on the battlefield than Wee. I mean, Yuta and Yuji were there, but like objectively, a lot more people would have died without his help. But at this point, that Kirara checks in and says, you left me mid-combat. To which Wee responds, well, you're heavy. And like, am I taking crazy pills, or did Kirara not fight. I feel like I'm not forgetting something. Now this obviously leads to Kirara trying to jump Wee, and Hikari has to drag him away. And yes, Kirara is a man. Like I said, Hikari, lover of femboys. Now Kusakabe checks in to check Wee and says that while you were out busting your hump, your big sis was relaxing. At which point Wee introduces what is genuinely one of the dumbest writing twists I've ever seen in my entire life. As he goes, well, my beloved sister worked herself to the bone for the new shadow teachings. To which Kusakabe responds by saying, now that's a convenient excuse. And as we continue down the long line of people I don't currently need to be hearing from, Mei says, I won't deny a thing. My life is priceless, and there's no use betting on priceless. And while that does kind of make her the worst, goddamn is it relatable. The way I would dodge a draft, just like the way I would dodge a draft is crazy. Now, to this point that Hikari needs to move the conversation forward, so he goes, by new shadow style, you mean dealing with the binding vow, preventing the new shadow style from being taught to outsiders? And I just need everybody... I just need everybody to sit down for this one. This is like the least motivated I've ever been to talk about JJK. To this point, the Kusakabe goes, exactly! The inherited binding vow of the school's simple domain. And by schools, he means new shadow style school. The original creator, Ashiya Sadatsuna, created the binding vow with the idea of it being inaccessible to curse technique users, because simple domain is supposed to be used by non-curse technique users as a way to defend themselves against domain expansions. Mei chips in and says, well, as the generations fly by, the new shadow style was no longer of public interest, and the simple domain fell behind a paywall. Now, to this point that Yuji and Nobara are like the rest of us and are just shrugging with no idea what's going on. Mei goes on to say that they essentially monopolize the technique, invite disciples, and then have them undergo binding vows so that they can use the techniques. And since new shadow style techniques are the cornerstone of Jujutsu sorcerers who don't have their own techniques, they can recruit a lot of sorcerers. And thus they can force a lot of sorcerers into binding vows kind of against their wills. Now, this doesn't mean everybody you've ever seen use the new shadow style simple domain as under these binding vows. Todo learned the simple domain from Tsukumo in Mekamaru's style, aka the 4 tubes that Mekamaru created that withheld the simple domain that he fired at Mahito. And creating the simple domain and compartmentalizing it down into these tubes is the only way that he was able to use a simple domain. And thus Tsukumo learned this simple domain style from Mekamaru and thus taught it to Todo. The conversation then goes on with somebody asking Mei, so what's so tricky about this binding vow, stopping it from being taught to outsiders? But Mei goes on, well, that's only part of the binding vow. There's also the fact that disciples who go to the new shadow style school are unable to refuse a summons from the head of the new shadow style school. And since we know breaking a binding vow you make with somebody else is incredibly dangerous, this means that essentially all of the disciples of the new shadow style school are slaves to the head. Mei then continues on by saying, and then there's the especially troublesome bit, the lifespan. This isn't so much a technique or a binding vow, it's more like a curse. And although we don't necessarily know how true it is, apparently the head of the new shadow style school absorbs the lifespan of all of its disciples. Now this throws basically everybody in the room for a tizzy. Megami, Nobara, as Mei continues on by saying, well, yeah, but nobody knows who the head of the school is. On top of this, there's no way to tell if the lifespan contract exists. After all, there are plenty of disciples of the new shadow style school who have lived long lives. And that's kind of fair. Kind of like in Chainsaw Man when the American president uses the gun devil by offering 1 year of the lifespan of every American. So long as every single one of the disciples isn't dying at like 40, you can't necessarily know whether or not it was the contract or if they just died youngish. Mei then continues on with this completely pointless yapping by saying that when the head dies, the school's best disciple becomes the next head. However, only they're made aware of it, so there's no way to suss out who the next head is, because anonymity is important as the head of the new shadow style school. And it's at this point that Kusakabe checks in and says only the head of the school can make the binding vows null. Kusakabe continues by saying, as far as I know, amongst all of the top students in the new shadow style school, nobody knows anything about the head. But Mei chips in and says, well, there wasn't anybody who knew. As Kusakabe reveals, I'm the head of the new shadow style school now, which elicits a huge response from Miwa. I am so tired of talking about this. Kusakabe goes on to say that he's nullified all of the binding vows revolving around the new Shadow Style principles. At which point Wee checks in and says, at least save some of the benefits for the newcomers. At which point Mei, kind of like a big sister, hoists Wee up into the air and says, when you become the next head one day, Wee, you can collect a big monthly tuition from all of your students. And while this would be sweet, Kuala Lumpur happened. So I want these two away from me at literally all times. Now Wee yells out, "Ah, sis, you truly are a miser." And then we cut back to the candy shop. Actually, that's not true. Before we cut back to the candy shop, Mei says to Wee, it's time for the Jujutsu world to follow the real world and enter an era of subscriptions. Which is like it's actually a kind of funny joke. Then we cut back to the candy shop where the elder's asking, oh, how much? To which Mei responds by saying, for your life. And it's revealed that what happened on the first page of this chapter wasn't Mei asking for how much a candy bar was, but genuinely trying to extort an old woman. Though an old woman who's the head of the new Shadow Style school and has been seeping life from all of her students. So it's not a bad thing. The elder then asks, how did you know I was here? How did you know I was the head? To which Mei responds by saying, I just asked somebody with the proper information. And if Mei does genuinely have any role in this story, it is that of a spy. She does get things done that nobody else could. The elder then says that nobody should have that information, but apparently everybody's got a cost. Mei then goes on to explain what this head of the new Shadow Style school's plan was. As she says, gathering disciples until your power rivaled that of the three big families, you wanted to take over the Jujutsu world, including ousting the higher-ups. Right? And it's this point that either the elder yells out for Tengen to help her or realizes that Tengen is the person who betrayed her. Now, as to why Tengen would know who the head was, we can't really say. Like, the best guess I could make is that Tengen is the master of all barriers in Japan and the new Shadow Style revolves around the usage of barrier techniques, but that feels thin. This also may or may not confirm that Tengen is still alive. I don't know, it's kind of a weird inclusion. Mei then goes on to say that you would have needed years and years. That's why you drained the lifespans of your disciples. There was something you wanted to see, wasn't there? Aspirations like this seem almost priceless. And now, with the Zenin clan annihilated, we stand on the cusp of a great war, wherein both the Kamo and Gojo clans could face destruction. And it's this point that I remembered that Gojo was not the only member of the Gojo clan. He was the clan head and the only person who had the 6 eyes in the infinity, but the Gojo clan is still very much around. I'm sorry, I was wrong. It's just we never see anybody else from the Gojo clan. I mean, I guess we see like Gojo's parents walking around when he first sees Toji, but that's really it. Mei then continues on by saying, but you know, some things more important than money can't be protected without the proper funds. There were sorcerers who would have managed to survive if your monopoly on simple domain wasn't in place. And this is actually very fair. The fact that it's so difficult to learn simple domain, which is the best possible counter to a domain expansion, made it so a fair amount of people who got caught up in domain expansions ended up dying. Now, I can't necessarily name like anyone in particular, actually. I mean, Gojo died outside of a domain. Yuji knew simple domain. It just got blown away from him, so Choso had to sacrifice his life for him. But I guess, like, if Choso knew simple domain, he could have used simple domain on top of putting his blood around Yuji. But simple domain wouldn't have helped in that domain because it wasn't a guaranteed hit effect. It was just a ton of fire. Outside of that, Nanami didn't die inside of a domain. Nobara didn't die inside of a domain. Yuta didn't die. Well, Yuta did die inside of a domain, but it had nothing to do with the guaranteed hit. He was in his own domain. I think she's just referring to sorcerers in general, which is very fair. But Mei immediately shatters all the goodwill that she was just building up, as she reminds us that all of this is just for her little brother, saying, more than anything, you are trying to make my dear little brother damaged goods. That alone made this an inevitability. And for those of you who don't remember, genuinely can't say I blame you, Wee can use simple domain. He uses it against the smallpox spirit, and thus Mei cuts down the head of the new Shadow Style school. Now you might be wondering to yourself, Nick, why did I learn any of that? And genuinely, that's a really good question. Why does it matter how the new Shadow Style school works? Do I need to know about the head of the new Shadow Style school leeching years from their disciples? No, it's a concept that has not only introduced this chapter, but also concluded this chapter. Kusakabe is the new head, everybody gets to learn new Shadow Style, the old head is dead, which means all of the power that they collected and the force they wanted to be to rally against the Jujutsu world is gone. It is an open and closed plot point over the course of half of one of the more important chapters in JJK. And Genuinely, for the life of me, I do not know why we talked about it. It is 9 pages long. 10 pages if you want to count from when Miwa started talking. And the only way I can spin it even remotely positive is that the reason that it was introduced is because there's going to be a part 2 to JJK. But Nick, what do you mean? Well, in the last 2 pages of this chapter, Meme introduces a somewhat interesting notion. The fact that the Gojo family and the Kamo family are on the verge of a decisive battle. The loss of the Zenin clan has put the big 3 families in kind of a freefall, and now they're going to battle against each other to see who comes out on top as the #1 family and probably the strongest entity in the Jujutsu world. But there's only 2 chapters left in this story, and a battle between 2 legendary families to see who's going to come out on top of the Jujutsu Society is simply not gonna happen in 2 chapters. So maybe, just maybe, the reason this concept was introduced is so that we could now be given 3 factions heading forward in what would become Jujutsu Kaisen 2. The new Shadow Style School, the Kamo clan, and the Gojo clan. And the second part of Jujutsu Kaisen would revolve around this conflict. And as Jujutsu High is the centering point for people from all 3 of those factions, Jujutsu High would become a place of grand importance. And if some conflicts like this were to happen in the Jujutsu world, people like Gakuganji and Kusakabe would be heavily involved, which would give us a better opportunity to understand what life is going to look like post-Sukuna, and also better understand the governmental procedures of a Jujutsu-based world. But if that's not what's happening, and there is no second part to JJK, this is nothing. It is the most nothing I've ever willingly interacted with. There is no reason for this to be 10 pages. There is no reason to give me this exposition. If we're being entirely real, everybody's sitting down and saying, we should have done the battle this way, and then everybody else being like, no, the battle had to happen this way, is literally just Gege saying, oh, you guys wanted the story to end earlier? Here's why it couldn't have. It's the most nuh-uh chapter I've ever read in my entire life. And Maki is the person being nuh-uh-ed. It's bad. It was a bad chapter. And listen, I'm not going to be the person who's upset that people are surviving to the end of the story, but like, listen, if we're allowed to point fingers at MHA, One Piece, Naruto, and Demon Slayer for death baiting, then we get to do it with JJK. Higuruma, Kusakabe, and Yuta all could have very easily died, and then they were just snapped back into existence. No real explanation, no real plot relevance. They're just not dead. And I'm happy. They're happy, but I'm also allowed to be like, that's dumb. And this is my beef with Gege. See, I think Gege is an incredible writer, but he suffers from George R. R. Martin syndrome. If there is no part 2 to JJK, he's a fantastic builder and a terrible concluder. His character intros are goated. That's why so many people love Higuruma, even though Higuruma's barely been in the story as long as all the other characters. He is a fantastic fight choreographer and drawer. And in a battle shonen, that's one of the most important things you can be. But my god, the only character who got a good and satisfying conclusion in this entire story was Mahito and Nanami. I will say Nanami got a good ending as well. But ironically, both of those happened in the Shibuya incident. Every other character conclusion that happens after the Shibuya incident is terrible. Megami's just fine. Nobura's just back. Kusakabe, Higuruma, Yuta, just fine. And so they can do what exactly? Fight in the Kamo and Gojo clan battle? We know no Gojos, and the only Kamo we know left before the battle against Sukuna. Listen, I will fully get on my hands and knees and apologize if Gege announces JJK2 Electric Boogaloo, and we get to see the Kamo and Gojo clan battles and see how Gakuganji handles being the head of the Jujutsu Society. But if that doesn't happen, this chapter, unforgivably bad. And I know there's going to be comments being like, oh, JJK fans will never be happy. That's not true. I was an ardent defender of the last chapter. I said, yeah, I would have loved more information about Hikari and Arume and the Heian area and the higher ups, but I'm happy that Team Gojo was happy. But that was mostly hinged on the fact that I believed that the next 3 chapters would give me some of the answers to the things I wanted answers to. And like I always say on this channel, you can love something and be critical of it. Please, people. It's called being objective. It's really important. But I'm curious to hear what you guys thought about this chapter. Am I being too dour, or did you hate it as well? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, Like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Oh, bro, literally read JJK through TikTok. I've read the entire manga like 4 times.